My shadow, my abandoned twin, my silent reckoning. It is time we finally face each other. I know you can hear me, you always have. From the beginning, you were there. Watching, waiting, holding on to every word I refused to speak, every truth I swallowed, every fire I put out before it could burn too brightly. You were in the silence, in the hesitation, in the moments I told myself that being good, being controlled, being acceptable was more important than being whole. And I thought I was getting away with it. I thought that if I buried you deep enough, if I ignored you long enough, you would fade. That I could become someone else, someone polished, someone admirable, someone safe. But you never left. You stayed beneath the surface, taking everything I abandoned and keeping it alive. I had to be a good boy, a good kid, the quiet one, the one who didn't cause trouble, who followed the rules, who did what was expected. Because good boys don't raise their voices, good boys don't push back, good boys don't feel too much, want too much, take up too much space. So I learned to control myself. I learned to hold it all in. The first time I cried and they told me to stop. The first time I was told to man up. The first time I wanted something, really wanted it, but held back because I was afraid of what wanting too much might make me. I cut away the parts of myself that didn't fit, and they rewarded me for it. They called me mature, disciplined, a man. But they never saw what I left behind, and neither did I. Not at first, but you did. You gathered everything I abandoned, my rage, my defiance, my unfiltered truth. You held on to the instincts I ignored, the passions I denied, the hunger I was too ashamed to feel. And when I told myself that I was free of you, you waited, because you knew the truth. No one outruns their shadow. I spent years being who I was supposed to be. I built the life I was told I should want. I did everything right. And yet some mornings I would wake up, stare at the ceiling, and feel nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just nothing. Something had been carved out of me, and I didn't even know when it happened. I wasn't just tired, I was empty. That's what happens when you spend your whole life swallowing your voice. Do not react, do not. That was the rule. No matter what was said, no matter how I was treated, no matter how unfair it was, stay calm. Stay composed. Hold it in. Do not raise your voice. Do not let them see that it got to you, because losing control meant losing respect. I swallowed it, every slight, every insult, every time I should have stood up for myself but didn't. And I told myself that was strength. But was it? I see it now. The times I sat in silence at the dinner table, feeling the distance between me and the person across from me, my wife, my partner, knowing that something was wrong but not knowing how to fix it. Knowing that I was being told you never open up, but not knowing how to. The times I looked in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized, a man I had built piece by piece, disciplined, respectable, controlled, but with a fire in his eyes that had long since burned out. And then I saw them, the men who never held themselves back. The ones who didn't hesitate, didn't censor themselves, didn't second-guess every move, the ones who walked into a room and owned it. I told myself I despised them, that they were reckless, arrogant, selfish. But that wasn't the truth, was it? The truth was, that should have been me. I should have been the one unafraid to take up space, to want what I wanted without apology, to step forward without waiting for permission. I had been taught that wanting too much made me dangerous, that confidence was arrogance, that standing my ground was aggression, that ambition was greed, that trusting my instincts was recklessness. So I made myself smaller. I told myself it was better this way, that I was in control, that I was doing the right thing. But what is a man if he spends his whole life making himself less than he was meant to be? I see it in other men now, the ones who dismiss their own dreams because they are too old, too late, too far down a path they no longer believe in. The ones who have learned to manage their desires rather than chase them. The ones who have stopped asking themselves what they really want, because the answer terrifies them. I was one of them. Until I started hearing you again, until I started seeing all the ways you had never left me. That flash of defiance when someone pushed me too far. That instinct to walk away from a life that no longer fit. That whisper of a voice that said, "This is not all there is." That was you. I thought you were my burden, but you were never a burden. You were a king in exile, the forgotten king. The one who once held all my courage, my fire, my drive, and was cast out when I was taught that wanting too much made me dangerous. The shadow does not simply fade when ignored, it festers, it waits. And when it returns, it does not return with a request, it returns with a reckoning. I was not ready for the truth. But there were men who were. There were those who saw through the lie, those who spent their lives searching for what most men run from, and they stripped life down to its rawest form. They saw the truth beneath the illusion. They understood what I had spent years denying. Carl Jung, who warned that what we reject in ourselves does not vanish. It waits in the dark, shaping us in ways we refuse to admit. Robert A. Johnson, who saw that the shadow does not just hold our darkness, but also our lost strength. The power we feared, the fire we were too afraid to touch. Marie-Louise von Franz, who revealed how men project their shadows onto others, mistaking their own insecurities for external enemies. Friedrich Nietzsche, who knew that to deny the shadow is to invite destruction, that the deeper we repress it, the more violently it returns. Lao Tzu, who whispered the simplest, most devastating truth that true power does not come from control, but from harmony, the acceptance of all that we are, not just the parts we are willing to face. I wish I'd listened to them sooner. I wish I had understood before I wasted years trying to be something I was not. But it is not too late, not for me, and not for you. I will not run from you any longer. The question is, when I turn to face you, will you be friend or foe? My shadow, my mirror, my silent witness, you have waited long enough. I thought I could silence you. I thought I could erase you. I believed that if I buried you deep enough, if I ignored you long enough, you would wither away, forgotten, nameless, powerless. But you were never weak. You were never gone. You were watching. You were waiting. And all this time, you were shaping me in ways I refused to see. Carl Jung knew your nature before I ever did. He was not just a psychologist. He was a man who walked the edges of the unconscious, who stared into the abyss most men are too afraid to even acknowledge. A man who saw through the illusions of what we pretend to be and confronted what lies beneath. Where others saw chaos, Jung saw a map, a blueprint of the human soul, and he charted the darkness, not to conquer it, but to understand it, to guide those who had spent their lives running from themselves. He called you the shadow, the self I abandoned, the fire I feared, the instincts I locked away. He saw what I could not, that you do not vanish simply because I refuse to look at you. You only grow in the dark. You do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. I never made you conscious, did I? I had to be a good boy, a good man, the quiet one. The one who didn't cause trouble, who followed the rules, who did what was expected. Because good boys don't raise their voices, good boys don't push back, good boys don't feel too much, want too much, take up too much space. Now, I remember the first time I swallowed my emotions instead of letting them out. Maybe I was 6, maybe 7. I remember my father's voice, sharp like a blade, telling me to stop crying. What are you? A little girl like your sister? He said, and so I stopped. And I learned. I learned that my pain did not matter, that my anger had no place, that my fear was a weakness. So I buried it. It didn't stop there. I remember the first time I was punished for speaking out. The first time I hesitated before saying what I really thought. The first time I told myself, just let it go, it's not worth the fight. And I did. And they praised me for it. They called me disciplined. They called me mature. They called me a man. They saw the polished surface, the perfected mask, and they applauded. But they never looked beneath it. They never saw what I buried to become what they wanted. And for a long time, neither did I. But you did. You gathered everything I abandoned, my rage, my defiance, my unfiltered truth. You held on to the instincts I ignored, the passions I denied, the hunger I was too ashamed to feel. And when I told myself that I was free of you, you waited, because you knew the truth. No one outruns their shadow. I spent years being who I was supposed to be. I built the life I was told I should want. I did everything right. I went to school, got a job, became a provider. I climbed the ladder, built a name, established a career. And yet some mornings I would wake up, stare at the ceiling and feel nothing, and not sadness, not anger, just nothing. Something had been carved out of me, and I didn't even know when it happened. I told myself it was normal. This is what happens as you get older. You just get tired. You just accept things. But that was never true. I wasn't tired. I was empty, and still I ignored you. Do not react. Do not. That was the rule. No matter what was said, no matter how I was treated, no matter how unfair it was, stay calm. Stay composed. Hold it in. Do not raise your voice. Do not let them see that it got to you. Because losing control meant losing respect, so I swallowed it, every slight, every insult, every time I should have stood up for myself but didn't. I remember sitting in meetings where I knew I should speak up but stayed silent. I remember hearing the disrespect in someone's voice and convincing myself it wasn't worth the fight. I remember biting my tongue so hard it almost bled, all because I'd been taught that a real man does not lose control. And I told myself that was a strength, but was it? Because even as I mastered the art of control, there were moments I could not explain. Flashes of anger over nothing, restless nights where I couldn't sleep but didn't know why. A bitterness that crept into my voice even when I thought I was being calm. The cracks were showing. Jung called this the gold in the shadow, the buried strength, the exiled power, the instincts I was too afraid to claim, because the shadow is not just what we fear about ourselves. It is also what we secretly long to be. I used to look at men who were bold, unapologetic, free, and I would feel something sharp twist inside me, jealousy, but I never called it that. I called it contempt. I told myself they were too much, that they had no discipline, no control, but that wasn't the truth either. Truth was, I had spent my life killing that part of myself. I had spent my life becoming a ghost in my own body. I don't even know when it started, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling, I stopped wanting, I stopped asking myself what I needed, and I told myself it was normal, that this is what happens as you get older. But that was never true. I wasn't tired, I was empty, and I was done pretending otherwise. You must face your shadow, or it will take control of you. Jung knew the truth I spent my life avoiding. The shadow is not just the part of me that I feared, it is the part of me that I need. And you, the one I buried, the exiled one, you have been patient, you have been watching, but you will not stay in the dark forever. My shadow, my hidden fire, my exile, I thought you were just the darkness. That was the lie I told myself, that everything I had buried in you was dangerous. Something that needed to be contained, controlled, eliminated. I believed that if I let you surface, you would consume me, that if I embraced you, I would become something I could not control. That is what they taught me, that men like me are made respectable by what they deny. That to be good, I had to strip myself of everything raw, everything untamed, everything primal. That discipline was not just about sharpening my mind. It was about suffocating my instincts. And I did what was expected. I pushed you away from... I took all the parts of myself that didn't fit. The ambition that burned too hot, the voice that was too loud, the confidence that felt too arrogant, the fire in my chest that whispered, take more, be more, want more. And I cast them into the dark. And thought that made me stronger, but Robert A. Johnson saw the truth, and he was not a philosopher locked in an ivory tower. He was not some distant academic speaking in riddles. He was a man who walked the path of the unconscious, who followed Jung's footsteps and went further, deeper into the abyss of the self. A psychologist, a storyteller, a man who stripped away the illusions of modern life and revealed the ancient forces still moving beneath the surface. And he saw something that most men never realize until it's too late. That the shadow does not just hold our darkness, it holds our greatest strengths. I never thought there was gold in you. I thought you were something to overcome, something to tame, something to master. I thought I was shaping myself into a better man by keeping you locked away. But all I was doing was making myself smaller. Because the truth is, you never just held my darkness, you held my power. You were the fire I feared. I see it now. The moments I let slip away, the words I almost said, the risks I almost took. The times I held back when I should have stepped forward, the opportunities I ignored because I was afraid of what I might become if I allowed myself to want something more. I had been taught that wanting too much made me dangerous. That confidence was arrogance. That standing my ground was aggression. That ambition was greed. That trusting my instincts was recklessness. So I made myself smaller. I told myself it was better this way. That I was in control, that I was doing the right thing, but was I? What is a man if he spends his whole life making himself less than he was meant to be? I see it in other men now. The ones who dismiss their own dreams because they are too old, too late, too far down a path they no longer believe in. The ones who have learned to manage their desires rather than chase them. The ones who have stopped asking themselves what they really want because the answer terrifies them. I was one of them. Until I started hearing you again. Until I started seeing all the ways you had never left me. That flash of defiance when someone pushed me too far, that instinct to walk away from a life that no longer fit, that whisper of a voice that said, "This is not all there is." That was you. I thought you were my burden, but you were never a burden. You were a king in exile, the forgotten king, the one who once held all my courage, my fire, my drive, and was cast out when I was taught that wanting too much made me dangerous. You must reclaim your shadow, Johnson wrote, or be ruled by it. I was ruled by it for years, I just didn't realize it. Because when a man does not claim his fire, it does not disappear, but it finds other ways to burn. It burns through resentment, through bitterness, through unexplained exhaustion. Through a dull, quiet ache that follows him through his days, whispering, "This is not who you were meant to be." I don't even know when it started, maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10, but somewhere along the way I stopped feeling. I stopped wanting. I stopped listening to the quiet voice that once asked, "What do you need?" I smothered it beneath duty, routine, and expectation, and I told myself it was normal, that this is what aging is, learning to live without wanting. But that was never true. I wasn't tired. I wasn't old. I was hollow, gutted of the fire that once made me alive. I was the shell of a man who had abandoned himself. And I see it now. I was never running from you. I was running from the power I was too afraid to claim. Not anymore. My shadow, my keeper of lost things. You were never just inside me, were you? You didn't just live in my silence, my hesitation, my buried instincts. You followed me everywhere. You stood behind my judgments, my resentments, my discomforts. You looked back at me through the faces of the people I couldn't stand, the ones I dismissed, the ones I found weak, arrogant, reckless, selfish. But it was never really them, was it? It was always you. Marie-Louise von Franz saw this before I did. She was not just another student of Jung. She was his greatest interpreter, his sharpest disciple. She took his theories and stripped them down to what truly mattered. She understood human nature in ways that most men never will. And she saw how the shadow does not stay buried. It projects itself outward. The most dangerous psychological mistake, she wrote, is the projection of the shadow onto others. This is the root of almost all conflicts. And I had been making that mistake my whole life. Because every time I looked at another man and felt an unexplainable dislike, every time I judged someone instantly, without reason, every time I told myself that he was the problem, that she was the fool, that they were what was wrong with the world, what I was really seeing was a piece of myself that I refused to accept. I see it now. The times I hated men who were too confident. The ones who walked into a room without hesitation, without apology, without doubting themselves. I told myself they were arrogant, that they had no humility, that they were full of themselves. That was never the truth. The truth was, I had spent my life suppressing my own confidence, making myself smaller, avoiding being seen. And so when I looked at them, I wasn't seeing them, I was seeing what I had killed in myself. I resented the man who spoke his mind because I had spent years silencing my own voice. I looked down on the man who took risks because I had been too afraid to take my own. I mocked the man who followed his gut because I'd spent my whole life ignoring mine. Von Franz called it the boomerang effect of the shadow. Whatever you suppress in yourself, you will despise in others. Whatever you fear in yourself, you will attack in someone else. And I had been living inside that trap. How many times did I tell myself I hated a certain type of person, only to later realize, sometimes years later, that I had been that person once, or that deep down I wanted to be. And how many times did I see another man struggle, and instead of feeling empathy, I felt disgust? The man who lost control, the man who was too emotional, the man who let his anger take him over. I told myself I was better than him, but I wasn't. I was just terrified of becoming him. It was in my father. The moments he would get frustrated with other men for not being strong enough, not being disciplined enough, not being real men. But I see it now clearly. He wasn't really talking about them. He was talking about the parts of himself he had spent his whole life trying to kill, and now I see it in me. How many times have I done the same? And how many times have I dismissed my own son's emotions because I was taught that a real man swallows them? How many times have I ignored my wife when she asked why I never really open up? Because the truth is, I don't even know how. How many times have I envied the men who had the freedom to be themselves, only to turn that envy into resentment? And what have I done with all of it? I have passed it forward. Because that is the cost of an unclaimed shadow. It does not disappear. It gets handed down. I had spent years judging the world without realizing that the only thing I had ever truly judged was myself. Von Franz saw this before I ever did. And she warned, if a man does not face his shadow, he will spend his life fighting ghosts. I was fighting ghosts. I was fighting the parts of me I had been too afraid to claim. But I will not make that mistake again, because I understand now. If I do not stop this cycle, if I do not break this curse, then my son will carry it next. And he will wake up in 20 years, staring at his own reflection, wondering why he feels like a stranger in his own skin. And I will have no one to blame but myself, but not anymore. I will not let my shadow rule me. I will not let my fears be passed down like an inheritance. I will face what I have buried. I will claim what I have abandoned. I will look into the mirror and see not a man shaped by fear, and not a man ruled by the ghosts of his past, but a man who has reclaimed himself, a man who no longer flinches at his own reflection, a man who stands unshaken in the presence of all he once buried, and this time I will not look away. My shadow, my twin fire, I feared, you were patient with. For years you waited in the dark, watching as I built a life that denied your existence. Watching as I convinced myself that I had outgrown you, that I had moved beyond the parts of myself I once feared. And yet, the longer I ignored you, the stronger you became. That is what Friedrich Nietzsche warned about. Nietzsche was not a psychologist. He was something more dangerous, a man who refused to lie to himself, a man who stared into the abyss and did not look away. And his words were not comforting, not gentle. He did not tell people what they wanted to hear. He told them what would break them, and his greatest warning, the more you suppress your shadow, the more it will destroy you. Beware, he wrote, that when fighting monsters, you do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss, gazes also into you. I thought I could tame you, but if I buried you deep enough, if I mastered myself completely, I would never have to face you again. That if I kept my anger locked away, if I silenced my hunger, if I avoided the thoughts and instincts that made me uncomfortable, I could become untouchable. I was wrong, because the shadow does not go away. It finds other ways to surface. It surfaces in exhaustion, in numbness, in the creeping sense that something is missing, in the strange feeling of being a spectator in your own life. It surfaces in the moments when, despite everything you have built, you look in the mirror and do not recognize the man staring back. Nietzsche understood this long before I did. He saw what happens to a man who spends his life running from himself. One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star, he wrote. A man who denies his own chaos becomes lifeless, empty, a hollow shell of what he was meant to be. And that is what I had become. I told myself I was disciplined. I told myself I had control. I told myself I had mastered my emotions, that I was calm, rational, unshakable. But the truth was, I had just become numb. I had made myself small so that I would never risk becoming dangerous. I had killed parts of myself so they could never rise against me. I had spent my whole life avoiding the abyss, only to realize it had been following me all along. That is what Nietzsche feared the most, that a man who does not integrate his shadow does not become good. He becomes weak, he becomes ruled by fear. He becomes a slave to the very thing he tried to control. Because what you suppress will rule you, what you ignore will consume you, what you refuse to face will one day become the thing that breaks you. I see it in other men now, the ones who have done everything right, followed the rules, played their part, built lives that should make them happy, but who wake up each day with a quiet, creeping sense of dread. The ones who snap over small things but tell themselves they are not angry men. The ones who resent their own families, their own choices, their own lives, but cannot explain why. The ones who feel like they are always one mistake away from losing control completely. Because that is what happens when you refuse to face the abyss. It does not disappear. It waits. It waits until you are tired, until your defenses are down, until your life is so tightly wound, so carefully controlled, that the only thing left for the shadow to do is break it all apart. Old friend, the fire I feared. I know now why you never left me. You were never my enemy. You were never a burden. You were the part of me that would not be erased, the force that would rather tear everything apart than let me live as a hollowed-out version of myself. You waited not to destroy me, but to wake me. Because a man who does not face his own abyss will one day become it. A man who refuses to see himself in full will be ruled by what he refuses to acknowledge, and I will not let the unexamined parts of me shape my fate in the shadows. I will face you, now completely without flinching. You, my shadow, the part of me I locked away, you have always been there. In the silence, in the anger I swallowed, in the ambition I tamed, in the fire I tried to put out before it could burn too brightly. You were the weight I carried but never acknowledged, the exiled force that never truly left me. For years I fought you, I tried to master you, suppress you, tame you, because I believed that strength meant control, that discipline meant denial, that being a man meant cutting myself in half, keeping only the parts that were acceptable, respectable, safe, but I was wrong. Lao Tzu understood what took me decades to realize. He was no conqueror, no philosopher of war. He did not speak of crushing one's enemies or bending the world to one's will. Instead, he spoke of balance. He taught that true strength does not come from resisting the forces inside you, but from accepting them, understanding them, integrating them. If you do not change direction, he warned, you may end up where you're heading. And where was I heading? Toward exhaustion, toward numbness, toward a life where everything was controlled, orderly, safe, but empty. A life where I had mastered every emotion except the one I had buried the deepest desire. Desire to live fully, desire to speak freely, desire to stand unshaken in who I am without apology, without permission, without fear. I told myself that the more I controlled myself, the better I would become. But Lao Tzu saw the truth. That trying to control life is like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you grip it, the faster it slips away. The softest thing in the world, he said, overcomes the hardest thing in the world. It is not control that makes a man strong. It is not denial that makes a man whole. It is balance. For years I thought I had won the battle against you. I thought I had conquered my impulses, my hunger, my instinct. I thought I had built a life on reason, on logic, on control. But the truth is, I had only built a life on one half of myself. Because you were not just my darkness, you were my other half. The wildness I once feared, the passion I once rejected, the fire I had spent a lifetime convincing myself was dangerous. But fire is not dangerous. It only becomes dangerous when it is left untended. I see it now. The men who refuse to integrate their own chaos, the ones who fear their own strength, their own rage, their own instinct, these are the men who snap. These are the men who break under the weight of their own repression. Because no man can be only good, no man can be only disciplined, no man can be only light. Lao Tzu saw what I had spent years running from. A man who does not embrace his shadow will always be ruled by it. For decades, I tried to force life into a straight line, to make myself something pure, something disciplined, something perfect. But life is not a straight line. It is water, flowing through every crack, breaking through every resistance. And the more I tried to fight the current, the more I suffered. I understand now why you never left me. You were never my enemy. You were never here to ruin me, to overpower me, to drag me into darkness. You were waiting for the day I would stop resisting, waiting for the moment I would stop gripping so tightly to an illusion of control, waiting for me to realize that strength was never about denial, it was about balance. You were not my burden, you were not my flaw. You were the other half of me, the force I needed but feared, the current I fought when I should have learned to flow with it. And I will fight you no longer. I will move with you, not against you. My shadow, my abandoned twin, my silent reckoning, you were never meant to be my enemy. You were never here to ruin me, to control me, to drag me into darkness. You were only waiting for me to stop running. I have spent a lifetime avoiding you, splitting myself in two, denying, suppressing, hiding. I've spent years convincing myself that if I buried you deep enough, if I ignored you long enough, you would simply disappear. That I could live a life of discipline, of reason, of mastery, without ever acknowledging the weight of what I left behind. But you never disappeared. You followed me. In my resentment, in my exhaustion, in the anger I swallowed and the dreams I abandoned. In every quiet moment when I looked at the life I'd built and asked myself, is this all there is? You waited it. You waited as I fought you, as I projected you onto others, as I told myself that I'd moved beyond you. You waited as I mastered the art of appearing whole while feeling empty. You waited as I walked further and further from the fire that once burned in me, because you knew, long before I did, that I would return to earth. Because there is no peace in half a life. And now I see the truth. Carl Jung saw it first. He knew that no man is complete until he integrates his shadow, that to become whole, we must reclaim the parts of ourselves that we abandoned. Robert A. Johnson saw that the shadow does not just hold our darkness, it holds our lost strength, our hunger, our power, our potential. The gold we thought we had to reject to be accepted. Marie-Louise von France saw that the shadow does not stay inside us. It projects onto the world around us. That the people we resent, the people we fear, the people we judge most harshly are often mirrors reflecting the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. Friedrich Nietzsche saw what happens to a man who runs from himself for too long. He understood that the abyss does not disappear, it waits, and when a man refuses to face his shadow, it consumes him in ways he never expects. And Lao Tzu, he saw the final truth, that a man's strength does not come from control, but from balance. That to be whole is not to be only light or only dark, but to walk between the two, knowing the power of both. And now I see it too. I understand why you never left me. You were never the weight I carried. You were never the voice I had to silence. You were the fire that once made me unstoppable. The instinct that knew what I wanted before the world told me what I should want. The hunger that made me push forward, that made me take risks, that made me feel alive before I traded it for safety. You are the forgotten king, the fire I feared, the exiled one, and I will exile you no longer. I will not spend another day pretending I do not need you. I will not reject my own strength. I will not fear the fire. Because the truth is, you were never here to break me. You were here to make me whole. And now at last, I am.